Hello, Professor Stiglitz.
Hi, how are you?
Hello.
Where is Hikma? What does Hikma stand for?
We are Benedetta and Andrea. We are Hikma's head coordinator. And Hikma is an Arabic word meaning wisdom. And we decided this name for our association because it represents what we aim to do. It's like increasing wisdom and sharing knowledge. And we're very happy that you're here with us tonight. We're sorry that you cannot be live at our Hikma Summit of International Relations, but we're happy to have this chance to meet you and to register this conference in an interview style with Professor Negroni. Professor Negroni, if you want to.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, of course. I want to give you a very warm welcome on the behalf also of the University of Bologna and the Department of Economics at the University of Bologna. I'm very honored to be here with you.
Oh, it's a pleasure for me too.
You have many Italian friends.
Yes, well, actually, I'm going tomorrow to Italy.
Oh, really?
That was part of the complication of my schedule.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you for being here. We are definitely honored to host you in our summit. So thank you for deciding to dedicate a part of your time to our conference. Now, as you know, we organized this conference to talk about inequality, and inequality is one of the main pillars of our summit this year in this 2021 edition, along with sustainability and digitalization. These three pillars represent basically the three major challenges that we, the students of the University of Bologna, consider as important challenges for our present and our future. Challenges that need to be analyzed and need to be addressed. In particular, talking about inequality, I would like to quote some data, so I'm going to read them. World Inequality Report shows that since 1980, the share of national income going to the richest 1% has increased rapidly in North America, China, India, Russia, and also Europe, even though more moderately, say, in Europe. Second, according to the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report, the world's richest 1% own 45% of the world's wealth today, which is roughly a bit less than 1/2 of the wealth in the world. So, I mean, I think that these data give us a wide insight and a meaningful insight of the magnitude of this phenomenon, phenomenon that we call inequality. And I think it's also interesting to ask ourselves if this data raises not only issues regarding ethics, so ethical issues, but also issues regarding economic development itself. So basically, is inequality the necessary price for economic growth, or is it an obstacle and a threat to have further economic development? I think this is a very important question, but we are here to investigate on that with you. You are definitely one of the most influential and respected economists worldwide. You also won the Nobel Prize in 2001 for your studies on information asymmetry. And also you played many important roles in various governmental, international, and academic institutions. But above all, you wrote extensively on issues such as inequality and the side effects of globalization in many books that I think we're going to quote also during this conference. So once again, thank you for being here, Professor Stiglitz. I would also like to thank Professor Negroni, who will be the moderator for the rest part of our conference. Professor Negroni is a very much esteemed professor of our university. He teaches microeconomics and economics of inequality at our economic department. So, Professor Negroni, thank you for your availability and also for having helped us to structure, properly this conference. I know we don't have so much time, so without further ado, I leave you the floor, Professor Negroni, and I tell everybody to enjoy the conference.
Thank you. So first of all, Professor Stiglitz, welcome. And before starting, let me say that it's a daunting privilege to be here with one of the most important intellectuals of our time. Turning to our interview, my first question is the following. in traditional economic analysis, it is quite common to find arguments suggesting that inequality is good for society, since it would induce agents to take actions resulting in a larger pie for all. Do you subscribe such arguments?
Well, first, I agree that if there were no differences, if everybody's income was the same no matter what they did, whether they worked hard or not, whether they saved or not, that would attenuate incentives. So you have to have some degree of inequality, or at least the potential of some degree of inequality. But the extent of the inequality that we have today and the reasons for that inequality go just to the opposite. That is to say, I believe we are paying a high price for inequality. That was the title of one of my earlier books, explaining how high levels of inequality and the way inequality is created actually undermines economic performance. And there are many examples of this. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit later about rents, monopoly power, but when inequality arises from abuses like that, abuses like those the financial sector undertook in the years before the 2008 crisis, those kinds of inequalities undermine economic performance. When you have, as we have in the United States, massive discrimination and an economic system that deprives large fractions of the population of opportunity, that undermines economic performance. So my general view is that given where we are today, it's absolutely unambiguous that doing what we can to reduce the inequalities would actually lead to a better performing economy and a better performing democracy and society.
Economists often explain the rapid growth of inequality in the last 40 years or so by appealing to technological change and globalization. In your book, The Great Divide, you argue instead that an important part of the reason we have so much inequality is that, and quoting you, the top 1% want it that way. Could you deepen this point, please?
Well, the point I was trying to raise is that, yes, technological change and globalization play a role. There are some of the factors, but the issue is, how do we shape globalization? How do we respond to technological change? How do we even direct technological change? And those and many other aspects of why we have a society marked by so much inequality are the result of decisions, choices made, particularly within the context of our political process, which I argue in many countries is disproportionately affected by the top 1%. So let me just give you a couple of examples to illustrate. Globalization, as we've managed it, involves trade agreements, the movement of capital across borders, investment across borders, but it is governed by a set of international rules and domestic rules. Those rules have, by and large, been set, made, designed by the rich corporations to benefit themselves at the expense of workers in both the developing and the developed countries. So for instance, one set of the rules has to do with what are called investment agreements, which circumscribe the ability of governments to change regulations in ways which might advance the public interest, but might hurt profits. Example, the current investment agreements have the potential of allowing corporations to sue governments that put in place regulations concerning climate change, emissions of carbon, and putting at risk the health of the planet. There is now there's a law firm that is reportedly trying to gather plaintiffs to sue governments that had lockdowns in response to COVID-19, saying those lockdowns adversely affected their profits, even though they may have spread the disease. They say that under these investment agreements, you can't do that. We don't care about the spread of the disease. We only care about our profits. Right now, as another example, there's been a big debate at the WTO about the rules of intellectual property. Should the knowledge concerning the therapeutics, the protective gear, the vaccines that have related to COVID-19, should it be hoarded by the rich corporations, or should it be shared globally to make sure that the increase in the supply of vaccines and these other products that help us fight COVID-19? Fortunately, President Biden has just a couple of days ago said that he is going to open up discussions, encourage, support discussions, opening up the intellectual property discussions, a waiver of that. But let me tell you, it was really hard. It was the rules, Trump supported those bad rules, and several European countries, including Germany, still can argue for the continuation of those rules, which will lead to the spread of the disease and potential origination of new mutations that put all of us at risk. So these are examples of the way that the rules of the game are set internationally in ways that favor the corporations, but at the expense of ordinary individuals. There are many other examples of how government policy shapes globalization, technical change. Let me just give you one more example. Right now, too much of technical change is focused on replacing labor, the effect of which leads to an increase in unemployment, particularly of unskilled labor. But there's not sufficient research to try to save the planet, to address the problems of climate change. The reason is that we've chosen not to put a price on carbon that reflects the scarcity value, to put adequate regulations that would incentivize corporations to do more research to protect the planet. And low interest rates by the Federal Reserve may be desirable for certain perspectives, but it means the cost of capital is relatively low. And it means corporations have an incentive not to save on capital because the cost of capital is very low, but to save on unskilled labor. So that's the sense in which sometimes deliberately, but sometimes unintentionally, the rules of the game have been shaped in ways that lead to more inequality, both through globalization, technical change, but also through our antitrust laws, labor legislation, corporate governance, even bankruptcy laws. Every aspect of our legal and economic framework has been set in ways that unfortunately too often lead to more inequality.
This leads me to ask you another question, which is the following. Contemporary capitalism, rather than being based on true market forces, seems to be based on rent-seeking. So which are the connections between rent-seeking and inequalities? Also, can we ascribe finance, global finance, to a rent-seeking activity?
So let me try to explain more what the term rent-seeking means. One way of thinking about it is there are two ways to getting wealthy. One, to increase the size of the economic pie, and the other is to grab a bigger slice of the economic pie. And rent-seeking is those kinds of economic activities that are basically directed at getting a bigger slice of the pie. And many examples of rent-seeking, any effort that companies make to increase their monopoly power is rent-seeking, or to decrease the power of workers is rent-seeking. Among our greatest rent-seekers are those in the financial sector. And the 2008 crisis exposed the rent-seeking activity, but it continues going on. Let me give a couple examples. The credit card companies in the financial sector charge fees to the merchants that are a multiple of the cost of a transaction. They engage in a whole series of abusive credit card practices that have garnered for themselves in the United States tens of billions of dollars for something that the cost of moving money from my bank account to your bank account is a fraction of a penny. And yet they charge 1%, 2%, 3% or more. So that's an example of rent-seeking. The market manipulation in the foreign exchange market of the banks is another example of rent-seeking. They gained at the expense of other people. Society suffered as a whole. Predatory lending, and discriminatory lending, which American banks all engaged in, or almost all engaged in, are other examples of rent-seeking. So yes, the rent-seeking is pervasive in the financial sector. The point of rent-seeking is not only that does it not increase the size of the pie, in many cases it actually decreases the size of the pie. When you have a monopolist, he restricts output in order to make more monopoly profits. And you therefore distort the allocation of resources away from what would prevail in an efficient outcome. So this is an illustration of the general point that Federico raised in the beginning of our discussion. Is it the case that inequality leads to more or less output? And when you have this rent-seeking activity, it leads to a reduction in output and the welfare of society. And it's really one of the reasons that we can get both better economic performance and more equality by trying to do what we can to curtail this kind of rent-seeking behavior.
You said before that government has been captured more or less by the elite. If we move to the supranational dimension, international dimension, it's possible to say anything on the role played by the international economic and financial institutions in regulating and shaping inequalities. Did they play any role?
Well, you know, what I've been emphasizing in much of this discussion has been that inequality is the result, to a large measure, in the rules of the game. And the rules of the game increasingly are being set internationally, or at least the international rules circumscribe what domestic national governments can do. Now, the extent to which that occurs depends on what the international organizations do. And remember, they are nothing but the interaction of numerous governments. Okay. So one has to be careful in criticizing the international organizations, because to a large extent, those international organizations reflect the decisions made by national governments. In the past, obviously, the US government played a disproportionate role. So when you're criticizing the international organizations, you are often criticizing the US government and the role it played in shaping that. So it's been interesting to see how things have changed since I wrote my book, Globalization and Discontents, at the beginning of the century. Yeah. At the time, I was very critical of particularly the IMF, to some extent the World Bank, of the WTO. There's now been some changes, yeah, but not probably not enough. But just let me highlight a couple of those changes, because it's important to recognize that these institutions can change, and it highlights the role for civil society, for people agitating, because we still have democracies, and voices do get heard if enough voices are raised. So one of the things we've been talking about, inequality, beginning with when Dominique Strauss-Kahn was the managing director of the IMF, and then continuing with Christine Lagarde, and particularly now with the current managing director, there's been a lot of emphasis on the importance of inequality. The view that I talked about, that there's a high price of inequality, is sort of official policy at the IMF. And I've been at many meetings where they stress that to governments. So they've been trying to convey this message that inequality is bad for macroeconomic performance. It was actually very interesting when Strauss-Kahn first put this idea forward at the IMF. He was obviously criticized, and he responded, you know, I'm doing this not so much out of the goodness of my heart, but my mandate is good economic performance, and reducing inequality is important for good economic performance. So he linked this very much to the IMF mandate. Now there are many other aspects where you can see the IMF taking a very proactive role. For instance, in COVID-19, one of the issues was that the developing countries and emerging markets did not have the resources to respond to the economic downturn that the United States had. We spend about 25% of GDP, and obviously developing countries and emerging markets have nothing like that. To expand the fiscal space, to give the developing countries and emerging markets some room to take actions to resuscitate their economy. The IMF argued for the expansion of what are called special drawing rights, a kind of IMF money that would be given around the world according to the quotas, and for the reallocation of those from the rich countries that don't need them to the poorer countries that do. They really took up the leadership in pushing this agenda, and not surprisingly, the United States under President Trump vetoed that initiative. No good reason, just that the United States under Trump didn't believe in global cooperation, even if it didn't cost anything, US anything. So I'm pleased to say that, there was a strong civil society movement in the United States that articulated our concerns to the Biden administration, and the Biden administration took the right decision. And there's now a $650 billion expansion in SDRs underway. Another issue the IMF has taken up a lead of what to do about debt. Because if many countries, poor countries, are facing problems of difficulties of repaying the debt. So those are examples where the IMF, which had and still does in some countries, pushed austerity, which has led to, in many cases, increased inequality, and you've seen it in Europe. Yeah. They've changed their official position, and in many of their programs, they've actually changed the practice. Argentina is a very good example where they have not pushed so far austerity, and they played a very, very constructive role in debt and in being able to address both the debt crisis and the COVID-19 crisis. The other international economic institutions have also taken up the issue of inequality, poverty very, very forcefully, and the issue of climate change, which interacts with inequality. So I would say that at the current time, while sometimes the individual programs are not the best suited for addressing problems of inequality, the international institutions are actually playing a positive role. But there are certain aspects that really need to be rethought. I've given you an example, intellectual property, some of the trade rules, investment rules. So there's a lot of work that now that we've recognized the importance of inequality, and now that we've recognized how international rules can affect inequality, I think we have to go back to the drawing board and rethink the international institutions and their rules more carefully.
Concerning your country, America is often depicted as the land of opportunities, where even the poorest migrant can succeed and reach top position. How correct is such representation?
Well, it's a very important part of our self-image, and it's a very important part of what others think of us. Unfortunately, to a very large extent, it's a myth. And when I say that, I don't mean, many immigrants, even poor immigrants, do make it from the bottom to the top. There is opportunity. But what social scientists mean when they say it's a land of opportunity what are the life chances? It's not 1 out of a million. What are the probabilities? And in those terms, the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other country. In terms of the raw data, there are only 2 other competitors with the United States in terms of lack of opportunity: the UK and Italy.
My country. Yeah.
Yes. Now, I understand UK. I don't understand exactly all of what goes into why the data suggests that your country does not have mobility. That would be a question for you to, I'm sure you can bring to bear more institutional knowledge about why that is the case. I can tell you a lot about why, what the problems are in the United States, why we don't have good opportunity. It has partly to do with our education system, which is very local. And we have, over the last 40 years, an increase in economic segregation. So rich people live with rich people with poor people, and they go to local schools, and the local schools are locally financed. And so if you live in a rich community, you get good schools, and vice versa. If you live in if you're poor, you live in a poor community with poor schools, and that helps perpetuate inequality. And even though our universities are very egalitarian, we have what is called needs blind admission to our universities. That is to say, we accept students regardless of what their financial strength is. We accept them, and then we look at what they can afford, and the universities are sufficiently rich so they can make up for the difference. So, but the problem is we can't find enough children from poor families to make the cutoff to get into Columbia or Harvard, because they have deficient backgrounds at the high school and grade school level. So that's part of the perpetuation of inequality. And then, of course, another aspect of the perpetuation of inequality in the United States is that we have very low inheritance taxes, and they were lowered even further under Trump, who obviously liked the idea of inheriting a lot of money so he could squander what he inherited. So those are the 2 critical issues, how you have intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage through labor markets and financial markets.
In another book of yours, People, Power and Profits, you forcefully argue for what you call a progressive capitalism, which is based on a new regulation of the market economy, which is exactly your proposal. And how can your argument be translated into a sort of winning politics in terms of fight against inequalities?
Well, progressive capitalism is more than just regulations. It's also about public investment. It's public investment in education, infrastructure, technology. So it's enhancing opportunities by making markets more competitive, weakening the power of the corporations, increasing the power of unions, giving investments in people that will give people more opportunities. So I view that progressive capitalism is really centers around creating more prosperity, but most importantly, making sure that prosperity is shared. One part of my book that I talk about a great deal is how do we make sure that everybody in our society has better access to what you might call the basic perquisites of a decent life: good housing, education for their children, a secure retirement, access to jobs. I described there how the progressive capitalist agenda can actually meet all of these things, can do all these things. I talk about some particular mechanisms, some suited more for America, given our politics. Like I talk a lot about the public option in healthcare, in retirement, where the government competes with the private sector. I think in many areas it can outcompete the private sector in healthcare, in retirement, because private sector is really focused to a very large extent on exploiting other people, exploiting their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. Yes, we know that governments are not always efficient. You know that as well in Italy, but that's why, I think about a democratic progressive capitalism. I think of the public and the private sectors providing checks on each other, so that each tries to get the other part to work together, but also to be competitive with, so that we make sure that we get this kind of innovation, shared prosperity that I describe.
My last question concerns Biden's economic policy, although you have already mentioned it. What do you think about it? And is it a first step toward a progressive capitalism or not?
I think so. I have been very excited by what he has done in his first 100 days. Some of it has been quite dramatic. The magnitude, the scale, the vision. So, for instance, the $1.9 trillion rescue package had provisions that were directed at the most vulnerable, but also addressing some longstanding problems. So in 1 year, his package is forecast to reduce childhood poverty by 40 to 50%. I mean, that's amazing. A country where childhood poverty was standing at 20% of children growing up in poverty, which of course is not good for the long run prosperity of the country. That's being cut in half. That's a major achievement. But now his second and third proposals having to do with infrastructure, R&D, family leave, are really climate change, attacking a whole set of deficiencies in our economy. And that's why the motto, Build Back Better, is not just a slogan. It actually has done a really good job of identifying some of the major problems and saying, what can we do about these problems over, not the next year. It's not, problems that have festered for 4 decades are not going to be solved in 1 or 2 years, but it is a really important step in going towards this model of progressive capitalism that I outlined in my book.
So it is a sign that we are moving away from government captured by Wall Street and towards a government for the people, with the people, and by the people. So there is hope.
I very much so. And I think, we've seen decision after decision that is consistent with that perspective, including this most recent decision to try to get access to the intellectual property associated with vaccines for everybody. That's taking a global perspective on an issue that is affecting everybody in the world, but it also is in our own self-interest to make sure that the disease is contained everywhere in the world.
Yeah. Professor Stiglitz, thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Let me just say how pleased I am to have been part of this discussion. I wish I could have been there in person. But these kinds of discussions are extremely important for understanding how to reshape the world and reshape thinking about economics.